Hello, thank you for joining us today on Matters of Substance. This is Carly Samayoa, and Kaitlyn Griffin is here as well as a host.
Hello.
Hi, Kaitlyn. And today we have Jessica Herzog Hall joining us from the ACEs Indiana Coalition, and she's the director there. And so Jessica just did a presentation for our community about ACEs and discussed the ways that you should use the ACEs scoring and all of these things. So could you just lay some groundwork for our listeners about what it is that you do and what ACEs are, and just kind of let them know what's going on?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for having me. I'm really excited to be here. The ACEs Indiana Coalition is a newer group. Back in 2019, Dr. Robert Anda, who was one of the original researchers on the ACE study, came out to Indianapolis and did a talk, and about 1,200 people showed up to this talk. And Dr. Robert Anda was like, okay, clearly Indiana is very interested in this topic. We want more information. So he came out and trained 50 master trainers in ACE Interface, which is the presentation that he developed and created. And through this, the ACEs Indiana Coalition has been formed. And obviously COVID put a bit of a break on all of those things, but we've kind of just been kicking it into gear, and we're doing free presentations on the ACE interface, and it talks about the neurobiology of trauma and different sensitive periods in our brains, and the original ACEs study, important findings from that study, and then how we can really foster resilience in our children and build a self-healing community.
Wow. So you guys really are trying to help communities understand maybe what some root causes of trauma are then from these discussions.
Yes, absolutely. Something that was really discovered through the ACEs study in the first place was just how interrelated and how ACEs and childhood trauma just really are the basis of a lot of different things, whether it be mental health challenges or physical illness. They really discovered that ACEs was just kind of the jumping off point of how we could really start to prevent a lot of these different issues.
So when you typically go out to a community, what are some of the things that you educate people on? So for those who don't know, ACEs are adverse childhood experiences. I'm not quite sure if we mentioned that yet or not, but that's what they are. So what is it that you're sharing with these communities? Like, I guess if you could just explain what ACEs are, that would be a really great thing for the listeners to hear, I think.
Absolutely. So ACEs, as you said, stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences, and they are potentially traumatic experiences that occur before the age of 18. Originally, with the ACEs study, they looked at 10 main areas. They looked at different areas of household dysfunction. So if there was divorce, if there was substance abuse, somebody who may be mentally ill in the home, then they looked at the different forms of neglect as well as abuse, so physical, sexual abuse. And through these found those 10 main ACEs. And they created an ACEs questionnaire, which is 10 questions, and then you kind of get a score from this ACEs questionnaire. And it's a newer thing. I mean, this study happened in the 90s, so it's really starting to pick up steam now. But through this ACEs questionnaire, we can kind of help determine what some of the background is for individuals, what are some of the experiences that they've had. But it's definitely not a diagnostic tool. It's not a tool that should be used to determine services. It's really more for opening the door to start that conversation so that we can kind of start to build that compassion and that empathy among one another.
Yeah, and I think it's really important that we keep mentioning that this is not a diagnostic tool, because I feel like what's happening or what could happen is people are going to say, oh my gosh, here's this ACEs information that we have. There's a questionnaire. Oh my gosh, I have to start having all of my students answer this questionnaire, or if it's clients at a mental health facility, and that's, I'm going to do this. I'm going to be able to diagnose people or explain why they're having the issues they are just based on giving them this questionnaire. That's what I think. I mean, I think it's important that it's being talked about. I really do. I have the same sort of passion for this, but I do think it's important that they, pump the brakes a little bit. Make sure you're making informed decisions. Follow Indiana ACEs Coalition and learn exactly what Jessica's trying to explain about why it's a useful tool, but it's not a diagnostic tool.
Yes, absolutely. And the Commission on Improving the Status of Children came out with a position statement. It's a really easy one-pager that discusses all of this. And it's actually on our website, acesindiana.org. And it talks about the positive ways that we can use the ACEs questionnaire, but also how we want to stray away from using it as a diagnostic tool or using it as a fun quiz. Unfortunately, we have heard of cases where school systems are handing this out to students. And when we kind of take a pause and think about that, these are really traumatic experiences and questions that for some individuals, they may not even be fully aware and understand the gravity of some of these experiences and how it's kind of shaped them. So when we're talking about the ACEs questionnaire, it should really be given in a safe space, in a comfortable space. And we really think that we need to stray away from kind of giving it out to large groups where we can't kind of check in on people and make sure that we're having larger conversations surrounding these topics.
I remember I was in a training about ACEs a couple years back, probably 4 or 5 years now. And one of the things they did is they had us all, we were in a group of like 40 people right next to your coworkers. They had us all fill out the ACEs survey. And I was like, man, some of these things I'm not really sure I want the person next to me seeing me check off.
Yeah.
So I can see, I know from personal experience, the value of giving people a little bit of one space when it's happening, making sure they're in a comfortable situation where they don't feel if somebody around them can be watching what they're answering, and just, giving them the proper privacy to fill this out is really important.
Absolutely.
And so I'm glad you're out there like speaking for that, because I was just like, I know we're learning about this right now, but I feel like we shouldn't be doing this with 40 people hanging around.
Yeah, not necessarily, not the greatest thing to do. I think that for a lot of individuals, we find, they'll walk up afterwards and say, these questions, there was a lot of this that I wasn't really even aware of, and I'm seeing this score, and this is a high number, and what does this mean? And it just, kind of waterfalls into all of these different things. So I think understanding the background of the ACEs questionnaire, also understanding the background of the study. It was 17,000 participants that the majority of them were white individuals. They were middle class. They had graduated from college. So these were pretty privileged individuals that they were interviewing. And still, they found these common adverse childhood experiences across the board of these 17,000 participants. But it's really important to mention that the original study didn't include things like racism and discrimination, and there are so many other traumatic experiences. Trauma is very subjective to the person. What's traumatic to you may not be traumatic to me. So again, it's opening that door and really starting these conversations so we can move more towards a trauma-informed community.
Mm-hmm. So are you all, well, maybe not you, but do you know if there's any work on the horizons to change some of that, some of the questions to fit more, to be more culturally competent? Or is there a supplement that people should be looking for if they're working with a community who has maybe different adversities than another population?
Yeah, so there's been many ACEs questionnaires that have been created, honestly. There's the main one with those 10 questions that focus on those original ACEs, but a lot of different communities and a lot of different groups have gone out and created their own ACEs questionnaire depending on what they're seeing out in the community. It really depends on who you're talking to and what groups they're with. But yeah, I think that it's something that people have created multiple different questionnaires depending on what their needs are. Now, some researchers kind of vary in how they feel about that, because if we're talking about the ACEs score, they're talking about the original ACEs questionnaire and the original ACE study. When we create a new one, that's not the same definition of the ACEs questionnaire. So you kind of get into the weeds a little bit about common language and all these different things. But I think that, there's many questionnaires out there. So depending on what you're looking for, I'm sure that you can find it.
Would somebody that's interested in creating a questionnaire, would they be able to utilize you, or say there's an ACEs coalition in their state, would they be able to reach out to their ACEs coalition and say, hey, I want to take what we have, adapt it, and add a couple things just to kind of make sure they're on the right path so that they're not, coming in with really no knowledge base and just trying to assume something that would work? Would
Absolutely.
that be good?
Yeah. I think one of the great things about the ACEs Indiana Coalition is that we are professionals from so many different systems, and we come from so many different backgrounds and experiences. So usually if you're in need of a resource, we're able to connect you with a master trainer that has done this work for many years, which is really helpful because a lot of the time it can be very challenging to get individuals from different backgrounds and different professions all at the same table to have a bigger conversation, especially surrounding childhood trauma and how we build those trauma-informed processes. So yes, please reach out to us. As I mentioned before, our website is out there, acesindiana.org, where people can come and request presentations, and there's further information on our website as well.
Excellent.
Yeah, and I think it is really important. There's a few steps of starting the conversation, because first, I think it's a matter of people, they have to be able to read and see the material, maybe from the original ACE study, to really understand and sort of buy into the fact that this is science and that it's not, because as Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris said, this isn't just a bad behavior thing. This is a scientific medical thing. And I think, and when you get into explaining what exactly happens inside the body, I think it really, wows people. But it is, I believe that just based on some people that I know, that they need to understand that this is a legitimate scientific thing before they start to really prioritize it. Otherwise, people are just going to chalk it up as bad behavior. And it's really just not. And that's exactly what we're trying to avoid and prevent, I feel like. Because again, that just furthers the stigmatization, furthers the labeling, and then it just keeps them further away from receiving treatment. So
yes, absolutely. Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris is one of my favorites. She's absolutely amazing. And one of the first examples that she talks about is the bear in the woods. And if you're in the woods and you come across a bear, your fight, flight, or freeze starts to go and your amygdala starts to pump that adrenaline. And it sends those messages away from your prefrontal cortex so that you're not logicking out the situation, right? Because logic is not going to help you survive against a bear. So it's sending those hormones and those chemicals away from your prefrontal cortex, and you're focusing right on your amygdala. So you're going into that fight, flight, or freeze. However, that's great if you run into a bear once, but what if the bear lives with you? Or what if the bear is a constant reoccurrence in your life where your chemicals and your hormones and your neural pathways are becoming affected because of these traumatic experiences? And it absolutely is science. And scientists have found that with cortisol, which is one of the most common chemicals that gets fired off in the brain when we're experiencing trauma, cortisol is toxic to brain cells. So it quite literally can break away neural pathways and kill neurons in our brain cells. So this is science, and they have proven it. It is newer science, so there's still a lot we need to learn. There's a lot we need to discover. However, I think it's really starting to pick up steam, that we're starting to understand how deeply embedded trauma and ACEs can be in not only the brain, but the body.
Can you share some of the things that people see as lasting things that can occur in the brain and the body from these adverse childhood experiences?
Yeah, it's quite the list. I mean, when it comes to mental health challenges, we talked about the cerebellar vermis. I'm going to try not to go too deep into science here, but that's one of the parts of the brains that scientists are really finding is the seat of mental illness. And it's where they're seeing a lot of, the ADHD, the schizophrenia, depression, anxiety. And it's also one of the parts of the brain that is greatly affected by childhood trauma and ACEs, not only when it comes to the development of it, but also just chemicals being able to properly get there. You see a lot of those diagnoses. You see a lot of physical ailments as well. You see, a lot of issues with heart disease, and then we get into substance abuse, and whether it be struggling with alcoholism or drug abuse. There are so many different effects from childhood trauma and ACEs because, as I mentioned before, so much of it is subjective for that person. So what is traumatic to them may not be traumatic for another person. But the higher the ACE score, the more risk you have for different physical ailments, different mental health challenges. Now, that doesn't mean at the end of the day that is 100% going to happen, that because you have a 4 or more, you are going to get, depression or anxiety. It just means that there's a risk there, a risk that all of us can be aware of. And if we're aware of it, we can help prevent it, which can be all the difference in a lot of these different challenges.
I know that there's, I've heard, maybe correct me if I'm wrong here, but I've heard that that ACEs can affect things even into like obesity as an adult, having diabetes, heart disease, all of these diseases can compound or can occur because of the way that your hormones have had to kind of be in overdrive from ACEs throughout your childhood.
Absolutely. And it was actually obesity in women that's what Dr. Vincent Folletti was studying before he began the ACEs study. He was looking at women who had been sexually abused and who had really struggled with obesity and struggled with weight gain off and on. And he was finding this correlation between women who were using food as a coping mechanism. And it was protecting them not only from their abuser, but also comforting them as well. So when you start to kind of look at some of these common things like diabetes, like obesity, we start to see these connections where ACEs is the common thread between all of these health risks. So if we're able to start that conversation, it can change so much of the way that we handle these things.
So I have a question about when it is appropriate to use the survey. So if you could maybe give us an example of when it's appropriate and an example of when it's not, because I think, and not purposefully, of course, I think oftentimes people who think that they're using the survey or the questionnaire appropriately to help a client or a patient, they sometimes aren't using it in the best time frames or the way that it's intended to. So could you kind of paint the picture of doing it both ways so that our listeners can understand what's right and what's maybe not the best option?
Absolutely. So I think I'll start with not the best option first. And I think not the best option is to be given the questionnaire, like we mentioned, in large groups, with no kind of trigger warning to what's happening. But I think also on an individual and a direct level, giving out the questionnaire and then saying, okay, if they have a score of 4 or more, then they are allowed to have these services, whether it be, counseling or some sort of help with substance abuse or whatever, services those may be, because they have this magic number of 4 or more, which I say that because that's the common magic number that a lot of individuals choose, then they get these services. Or because I'm seeing 4 or more, I'm going to use this as proof for this diagnosis. Instead, the correct way for the ACEs questionnaire to be used in the way that Dr. Robert Anda intended it as he talked with us when he came here was to open the door to start a larger conversation. And that's something that Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris talks about in her book, The Deepest Well, was that she started this ACEs questionnaire and she started giving it to every single one of her patients as a primary care physician. And it was to open the door to start that conversation to understand what the source was for some of these physical or mental health challenges. She was seeing individuals that had a lot of the time been diagnosed with attention deficit disorder. Like across the board, it was ADD or ADHD that they were seeing diagnosis of. And what she found as she dug a little deeper was that a lot of it was their stress response was out of whack. And when that occurs, a lot of the time a diagnosis of ADD or ADHD follows, when in reality, the trauma is what needs to be talked about. And that needs to get, talked about and also healed from when it comes to that child or that family. So I think that using it in that way, by allowing them to answer the questions, seeing the score, and not immediately going down the lists of risk factors that they now have, but simply starting a larger conversation and then connecting them to services that would be helpful can make a big difference.
Certainly. And I also wonder if a primary care physician, say they decide to give the ACEs score, but they're not using it to diagnose, what services, I guess, what should their response be? That's, I guess, the better question.
Yeah, and I think that, again, Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris, talks about the reaction being of starting that conversation, of saying, okay, well, I'm noticing that you mentioned that you are experiencing, physical abuse, or you're witnessing domestic violence in the home. Can you talk a little bit more about that for me? And it's really hard because doctors are very limited on the time that they have. But Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris talks about this in her book, and the fact that if we're having those conversations now, you're preventing those patients from coming back years later with much more severe illnesses. If you're opening that conversation and getting the root of it beforehand, we can be preventing so many different physical illnesses and so many different mental health challenges. And just on an economic standpoint, how much more helpful would that be if we were preventing all of these things from happening? So even though it takes a little bit more time now, think about what we're doing for our future.
Mm-hmm. And then that brings me to my question. Yes, because I think when Dr. Harris explains that, it's sort of like, okay, well, so if a child has a symptom of something, I think an example she gave was asthma. But then because she asks the question of the child or the parent, the mom, whoever has the child in the doctor, is, okay, when do you notice that her asthma is heightened or she has an asthma attack? And she says, oh, well, I notice that it happens a lot when my husband is having a fit of rage or something. So being able to identify that and putting it together is, something that can be addressed, like you said before. But my question is, because I've sat and thought about this a lot, but the part that kind of worries me is when it comes down to being at home and the parents, because a lot of times this is happening between parents and children, or guardians or caregivers and children. They're experiencing these ACEs. So getting them on this, understanding that this is happening, or maybe they're the ones that are kind of causing this to happen. But it's like, how do you go about addressing that when you know that a child is at home experiencing these things, and then the mom or dad or whomever, it's not something that they prioritize or they even think is a big deal.
Mm-hmm. Well, and one of the beautiful things that we keep on talking about Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris, because she's amazing, and she talks about this in her book, in that was a problem, in that the kids were coming in and she was seeing these high ACE scores and she was seeing these physical and mental ailments. But then she was also making the connection of, well, what has happened to the parents that is now resulting in this behavior? So then she started giving the ACEs questionnaire to parents as well. And she's starting to see their ACE scores. And she's starting to understand that this is an intergenerational transmission of trauma that is occurring in this vicious cycle. So if you're able to also start that conversation with parents, because again, some of the time, they're not even aware that they're doing it. They're not even aware that this is the reaction to traumatic experiences that they themselves have had during their childhood. if you're able to provide that education and start that conversation and then possibly connect them to services, which is what she did at her office, well, then we can also start to heal on a family level, which that is so powerful because, like you mentioned, we may not be able to prevent that first ACE from occurring. But if we're seeing a buildup of repeated childhood trauma and repeated adverse childhood experiences, we can certainly prevent it from going from 4 to 5 or 3 to 4 or whatever it may be. And it's also looking at the family as a unit and understanding we are so interconnected when it comes to our experiences, when it comes to the importance of relationships. And so having that conversation and using the questionnaire to start that conversation could be huge, even with parents.
So when you're realizing that this is intergenerational, or when a practitioner is, and they start the conversation with the parents, what do they do if the parent is just not responsive? Because, perhaps this just feels normal now, right? Like, this is how I handle things. This is how I always have. Who are you to tell me that this isn't the right way to do it?
Absolutely. And I think that that's a repeated challenge for a lot of practitioners. I think when it comes to being a general physician or a counselor and therapist, we're seeing challenges, and there's that kind of backup from parents of saying like, well, no, this is the right way. And I think it's more, instead of approaching the situation and here's what you're doing wrong, it's more, here are some possible alternatives that we have found helpful. And, the way that you're reacting could be a result because of the experiences that you've experienced during childhood and these traumatic scenarios that have occurred to you. Here are some ways that might help you. And I think that coming alongside individuals versus going on the attack can make all the difference. If they feel like they have that supportive person, if you are showing them that you're not just another person in the system trying to check a box, and that you actually deeply care for them and their family, and you take the time to build that rapport, I think that could go a very long way when it comes to parents and children. Obviously, there will still be individuals that, because of their experiences, just refuse to change or see a different way. And if that's the case, who can we connect the child to? Who can be that supportive adult? Because even if it's just one supportive relationship, that can help the child foster that resiliency so that they're able to better handle future challenges.
And that's some kind of where mentoring can come in handy. I know it's not really the topic today, but I think that mentor relationship can really be good for a child who's having these experiences. It gives them a safe person to confide in. Now, I guess the question I have from this is, say the ACEs score is very high and anybody in Indiana is a mandated reporter. What is the threshold of that? Like, how does somebody handle that? If parents aren't really willing to get on board, then is it mandatory for the physician to report? Are the 10 questions even going to be something that are worthy of reporting if this child is getting these questions? Or
Yes. So I think it depends on what they're answering. Yes, we're all mandated reporters. So if we're seeing neglect or abuse in the home, then absolutely the physician has to be reporting that. Mm-hmm. I think that you can run into challenges when it comes to witnessing domestic violence or having somebody who is using substances in the home. I think we still need to be obviously reporting that. I think connecting them to services in general, if we're seeing any kind of ACE, is helpful. Because like we've mentioned before, you may look at that questionnaire and think, okay, well, they witnessed domestic violence one time. that they're probably fine, when in all actuality, that could have been incredibly traumatic for them. And that's another reason that we talk about being really careful with the ACEs questionnaire, because it doesn't account for frequency or severity. So even if they have an ACE score of 1 for, say, something like physical abuse, they could have been physically abused every single day of their childhood and still have an ACE score of 1. Or they are, witnessing domestic violence one time, and that's the only time that it's happened, and they still have the same score. So again, that's why we talk about starting the conversation and not using that as a diagnostic tool or a tool to determine services, because it doesn't account for that frequency or severity, which is really, really important to keep in mind. Did I answer your question?
Yeah, you did. You totally got there. But I'm glad you kind of worked into this severity and frequency piece, because that's really important to remember, right? I mean, a 1 is a 1 on the score. It could be 100 times of something happening or 1, and that's important for people to remember as they're utilizing this.
Right, absolutely. And as we've talked about, somebody could have an ACE score of 0, but they had another traumatic situation that's not included on the 10 ACEs, like racism and discrimination, like bullying, if they're LGBTQIA and they're disowned from their parents or caregivers. There can be multiple traumatic situations that individual may have had, and they have an ACE score of 0 because it's not within those 10 main ones. So even if it's a 0, we're still kind of following that up and making sure that individuals are okay, and we're seeing that empathy and that compassion and building more towards that trauma-informed community.
Yeah. So I have a question that kind of loops us back to the beginning really quick. And I remember learning this in a training, and I found it very interesting. And so I'm hoping that you might have some information to shed on this. But when I learned about this, when it comes to ACEs, even an infant is affected by it. So people oftentimes have like this mentality, if they can't speak, they don't understand. So, it's not that damaging yet because my baby's 2 or 1 or whatever. And I mean, at least what I was taught, that's actually completely untrue. Can you kind of shed a little light on that?
Absolutely. And I'm not a scientist, so I don't want to act like I am. But it's incredibly important, because there's still, between those ages, even when we're like in utero, we can still experience trauma. And even if it's before we start to build that autobiographical memory, we can still hold that trauma, and our brain can still be changed and altered from that trauma. We talk a lot during our trainings about the development of neural pathways and how we're born with very few neural pathways, only the neural pathways that we need. So for eating and going to the bathroom, for connecting to a caregiver. And then there's this growth process that happens through birth to about elementary age, where we build all of these new neural pathways. And that's because neural pathways are strengthened by experiences. So those experiences that happen over and over again, those are the neural pathways that are going to be strongest. And the ones that don't happen repeatedly will kind of die off as we grow up between elementary age to puberty. And that's that pruning process that occurs with our neural pathways. But scientists across the board have found that 0 to 3 age is so important when it comes to the experiences and the connections that we hold with individuals and the relationships that we form. So even if we don't remember some of those traumatic experiences, they very much can alter the development of our brain, and it can alter physical processes as well.
I find it so fascinating that there is so much that plays into ACEs and how it can affect somebody, because you don't really think about it, you don't think about it on that scale. And it kind of blows my mind that all of these things really play a part.
Yeah, absolutely. When you start to kind of dive a little bit deeper and start to kind of look at the root of so many of these physical illnesses and mental illness, a lot of the time, those ACEs are the common thread between all of those different things. And it's amazing that we only started learning about this in the 90s. Like the leaps and bounds that we've made in this short amount of time is astounding. And there's still so much that we have to learn and discover. One of those fields is epigenetics, for example. So epigenetics is basically the understanding of what gets under our skin. So how our genes are changed and altered from experiences. And what scientists have found is that our genes not only change because of adverse childhood experiences, but the reading of our genes can also be changed by those experiences. So when we talk about intergenerational trauma, when we talk about passing historical trauma down from generation to generation, epigenetics is also a huge part of that, because we see those changes in gene reading and the altered shape of our genes. So we start to run into, for example, substance abuse being passed down from generation to generation, or most commonly, depression or anxiety we see passed down through generations. It's really, really interesting when we start to dive deeper and understand some of the science behind all of this, because it's so common. The statistic is 60% of the population have at least one adverse childhood experience.
So high.
So high. And 30% have 3 or more. So when we think about this, it's so common and the science is out there. We just have to kind of take steps to learn more and educate ourselves, because that really can make a huge change for the people that are in our lives.
Yeah. So if somebody's listening right now and they're like, I'm realizing I kind of fit into this category. I've had trauma when I was younger. Maybe my parents also talked about trauma that they experienced when they were young. But I don't want to have this affect my child the way that it's affected me. What do they do?
Such a great question. And there's this beautiful thing that's happening, especially through our generation, where we're really starting to identify that. There's this process that's happening in this generation where we're saying, oh, these responses were an effect of trauma. And I saw that in my parents. And now that I see that in me, let me fix that so I don't pass that to my child. And there's numerous ways that you can go about that depending on the scenario. I think that one of the biggest things is being able to identify that maybe you have some effects of that trauma, maybe that be in some of your reactions or, some of the way possibly like your physical body is reacting to certain scenarios. And I think being able to identify that first, and also not shame yourself for it. These are biological reactions. And a lot of the time they're automatic. It's the way that our neural pathways have been made. It's the way that our brain has been shaped. So allowing room for some grace and some forgiveness, and then kind of taking steps to say, well, what are some ways that I can help me? What are some ways that I can practice? Self-care is commonly like that fun buzzword that we use, but it's actually incredibly important. So then we can help the future generations. My niece and my nephews are huge parts of my life, and being able to be that positive relationship, providing that nurturing, that care, and also helping them to build their self-efficacy and that belief in themselves can really, really help to not pass on some of those responses from trauma.
That's a great point. Even if you don't have kids, you can be the solid person in somebody's life. I know from experience that, we had a huge support system, like our whole family. We were just all super supportive, but that's different than a lot of people have. And so I think about like just the good times I got to have with my extended family and how important and how impressionable that was for me, or how much it made an impression on me. And, it's just a good point to recognize that just you can be that strong person, the good influence on somebody, or give a child the ability to feel connected to an adult, even if you aren't a parent to them.
Yes, 100%. And Dr. Bruce Perry talks about this a lot. He is huge when it comes to understanding childhood trauma and understanding just the effects of trauma in general. And he talks about it all the time. It just takes one. It just takes one person to be that nurturing and loving adult in their lives. And that can just stop and alter a lot of those responses to trauma that you see just from that one person. And yeah, it doesn't have to be a parent. It can be a coach. It can be a teacher. It can be an aunt or an uncle or sibling. It doesn't matter what your official title is. If you are that one person for them that they can come to and feel safe with, that can change everything for that child.
So if you're listening and you see that maybe you have a child in your life who's going through these experiences, remember, you can make the difference.
Absolutely, 100%. And if there is a child that you know of that is experiencing some of these things, what are some tools that I can help provide? Can I talk to them about teaching them about self-regulation? So like, for example, mindfulness and meditation have been proven to help so much when it comes to our self-regulation. Can I build some self-belief and some self-esteem with them? Can I give them some, goals or some little tools to help them achieve different things so that they can feel positive? Am I giving them that positive reinforcement when they achieve even the smallest thing? It's leading with empathy. And that can just change relationships, and it can change communities, and it can change so many different levels of the human experience when we lead with empathy.
Yeah, certainly. Well, we are almost coming to a close. We have about 5 minutes left. So I just wanted to make sure there's not anything that you feel we need to cover before we end here.
There's so much I feel like we could talk about.
Sure,
I can't believe
certainly.
that we're almost at the end already. I would just say that if individuals have questions, please reach out to us. Reach out to us through our website, acesindiana.org. If you're interested in having a presentation, please request a presentation from us. We have 50 master trainers. We are training more master trainers in October. So if you yourself are interested in becoming a master trainer, please let us know. Really, our main goal is to educate communities and to get the awareness out there so that we can really start these conversations and we can start changing and growing communities to be more self-healing and more trauma-informed so that future generations are safer and can grow up without the accumulation of ACEs, but also those individuals that have experienced these things can feel safe talking about it and feel not stigmatized about coming forward and discussing some of these responses to trauma, because it's a normal biological response and they have adapted to their situation. That term maladaptive, I don't love that, because they're adapting to what is a very, very serious, very threatening scenario. So I think, just leading with that empathy and that grace and allowing a safe space, a non-judgmental space for individuals to have this conversation can really help us move Indiana forward to being a trauma-informed state.
Yes, I agree 100%. I love everything you've said today. I think that ACEs is such an important thing for people to be aware of, because it is fairly new and people just don't know. And I know that, like, if you're a professional, we tend to have a little bit more exposure to this concept than people who are not within, like, prevention, education, anything specifically to acting with kids. So I just really appreciate the ability for us to get on here and make something available to everybody.
Absolutely. No matter what system you're in, whether it be healthcare or law enforcement or, the school system, no matter what system you're in, this is applicable to the work that you're doing. Because more than likely, we're all talking to someone or having relationships with somebody who have experienced adverse childhood experiences. So, this understanding, even the basic line of this, can make such a difference.
Yes. Well, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Yes.